couple of years ago, I came across this quote from some professors at Princeton who were doing research on how do we address the climate crisis. And it really stopped me in my tracks. So Princeton's putting out this report saying, we already know how to do it. And here I was instead really far more familiar, I think like many of you, with images like this. Be worried, be very worried. You know, we can't turn on the news without hearing about the fires in Russia, the floods in Australia. You know, just this week, 1 million people in Sri Lanka displaced. And I was pretty overwhelmed. And I went through a period, especially after the United Nations climate change negotiations in Bali and then in Copenhagen, pretty depressed. And so I decided, look, I'm going to find out, is it really possible? Can we really do this? Do we have the technology that we need, or are we waiting for some major game changer, some major breakthrough? And what I found is that it's true. We do have the technology today. We not only have the technology, but it costs less and it creates more jobs. I found out that Greenpeace and the German aerospace engineers and the European Renewable Energy Council have been working together for years with scientists and engineers from around the world to study whether it's possible. To look at the modeling of how do we produce energy and transport ourselves around the world, and how can we do it differently by dramatically reducing dirty energy and nuclear and seeing if we can do it clean. And what they've found is that it's possible, and what I found in my research is that it's already happening. So hold on a minute. It's possible and it's already happening, but the United Nations tells us that climate change is the greatest threat that humanity faces, that more people today are displaced because of climate change than war. So what are we waiting for? Why isn't it happening? So all too often we're told that it's not happening because it's too expensive, because of economics. In Canada, finally, Prime Minister Harper is telling us that, yes, he's also saying it's humanity's greatest challenge. Of course, a couple months earlier, he was referring to Kyoto and the United Nations climate change agreements as a socialist scheme to suck money out of wealth-producing nations. But anyways, the polls changed, and he changed, and now he's even saying that climate change is the greatest threat to humanity. And he's saying that because the tide is turning. So how do we know the tide is turning? We know that because what we've seen is that global investment in new renewable energy capacity has gone up 700%. So even though it's gone up, the government tells us, but you know, it's too expensive. It's going to level off. It's going to be too expensive for us to continue. It doesn't create as many jobs. But so what the energy revolution found is that, in fact, by 2050, it would be $100 billion cheaper to have clean, renewable energy instead of oil and coal and nuclear. So still, we hear that, but right now, it's not competitive. Well, there's a reason that renewables are not competitive right now. It's because our governments are using our money, taxpayers' money, and giving it to big oil and big coal to line their pocketbooks. And make no mistake, we've had economic hardship, but they have record profits. And they do because they're getting 12 times as much money than renewables are getting. You can't stimulate the new investment. You can't stimulate the new projects, the wind and solar that we need, when they simply can't get a leg up. So almost half of Canada's total greenhouse gas pollution comes from heavy industry. So our government is telling us that we're going to have to make hard sacrifices, that yes, climate change is important, and we need to address it. We need to ride our bikes to work. We need to change our light bulbs. And they're right. There's no question that we need to change our lifestyles so that we're ensuring that there is less global warming pollution building up in the atmosphere. But let's face it, if half of our emissions are coming from heavy industry, in fact, globally, if the majority of the world's pollution is coming from a few companies, a few industries, we don't just need better light bulbs, we need better laws. The majority of Canada's rise in emissions is coming from here. This is the boreal forest, and underneath the boreal forest in Alberta lies the tar sands. So we've gotten to a point where we're actually clawing away at the earth to get at some of the last of the oil. We're drilling in some of the most remote regions of the planet, in the fragile Arctic waters, where a spill would be so much more disastrous than even what we saw last year in the Gulf of Mexico. Here in the Alberta tar sands, we're pumping out 1.5 billion liters of toxic water a day into open pit ponds that we have no idea how to deal with. At that point, when you see simply some of the largest and most destructive practices on Earth, and they're telling us to ride our bikes, it seems like the solutions that are being proposed for us to engage in are just not commensurate with the problem. So we need stronger laws. Imagine if we did. Imagine if we had a world where we didn't have to see images like this, where we didn't have to fear for those oil spills. Imagine if we had a world where the 2 billion people who today do not have any energy, do not have access to electricity, have clean, safe energy. Imagine a world where we can start to mitigate some of the worst of the climate disasters. Imagine a world where we're not faced constantly with resource conflicts over some of the last fossil fuel reserves. And imagine a world where it's cheaper because you're not pulling up your car to a gas station. You're fueling your electric car at home, or you're taking safe and clean and easy public transportation. The amazing news is that that world is within our grasp. So this is where we get our energy from today, and this is the trajectory that we're on. Renewable energy is increasing, but the majority of our energy now comes from oil, from natural gas, from coal and nuclear. Under the energy revolution scenarios, we would have a 95% cut in carbon dioxide emissions. To put it bluntly, we would stop using the atmosphere like an ashtray. Right now, what's happening is that global warming pollution is building up in our atmosphere, and it is literally like a blanket smothering the planet. And it doesn't need to be happening. So the amazing news is it's already started. So in 2008 and 2009, for the first time in human history since the Industrial Revolution, new investment in wind, in solar, in renewables exceeded new investment in oil, in coal, and nuclear. We are living the energy revolution tipping point right now. This is on the Silk Road in China. This particular wind farm, 200 wind turbines, an enormous number of jobs that are in people's communities where they need the jobs. And you know, we all hear a lot about how many coal plants are going up in China every day. But what we don't hear is that last year, every 2 hours, China put up a new wind turbine. This is in the UK. This house has actually, for 15 years, produced more electricity from those solar panels than the woman who built it could use, not only in her house, but also now in her electric car. And we're seeing amazing solar installations like these that are in the communities. So they're not connecting to the grid, but they can be anywhere in communities around the world. This one in particular in Jalka, India. And then also we're seeing large concentrated solar power installations that are connected to the grid and can have an enormous impact in displacing coal. So this installation in particular provides electricity for 200,000 homes. And it has displaced 189,000 tons of coal. I love this one. The power comes from concentrated solar plant, creates heat, and actually feeds 30,000 people today, every day, in a temple in India. So in Europe, there was more newly installed capacity. Over half of the newly installed electricity capacity came from renewables. So sometimes it feels like it's impossible, that it's going to be too big. We're talking about changing our energy systems, our transportation systems, and it pretty frequently feels like we're running against the clock because there's bad news all the time. And we know that emissions are still rising, that we're producing more global warming pollution today than we were yesterday on the planet. But I want to share with you a story because when I came back from the United Nations negotiations in Bali, I almost stopped doing this work, because I couldn't figure out a way, I couldn't see a path where we could do it and make the changes that are required. And I was sitting with my grandmother, who's 92 years old, and I was talking to her about it and how scared I was about everything I was reading. I'd just seen a scientific panel where they were talking about predictions of what would happen if we allowed climate change to continue unabated. And she said, "Will you just stop that?" in the way that only a grandmother can. And she said, "Don't you realize that I have watched the world entirely change in my lifetime? You know, when your mother was growing up, we didn't even have a phone. We had a party line. If it rang twice, it was for us. You know, we didn't have a television. I didn't know anyone who had ever been on an airplane. We didn't have computers, let alone that Raspberry you're always holding, she said. She meant my BlackBerry. And I thought about it for a minute as she told me about what it was like for her growing up and raising my mother, about the incredible changes that she'd seen in her lifetime, how society had entirely changed. And for the first time in a really long time, I imagined a world where I was going to be sitting with my grandkids and telling them about this crazy time when we clawed at the earth to get the last of the oil, this crazy time in our history when we used to pull up our car to the gas station and fill it with gas. And they're going to be amazed because they're not going to be able to imagine a world that existed like that. How are we going to create that world? What do we have to do now? It's not going to happen on its own. It's not going to happen without us demanding that our government act for us, the people who elect them, and not just for the big corporations. It's going to require a phase-out of fossil and nuclear subsidies. It's going to require governments putting an effective price on carbon, like in British Columbia, where we have an economy-wide carbon tax. It's going to require people supporting it, so governments know that they have the social license to do the right thing. It's going to require us supporting efficiency, pay-as-you-save programs, and learning to understand what that means, taking the initiative. It's going to require our government setting targets for renewable energy. It's going to require us supporting change, which isn't always easy for us. Supporting new renewable energy, ensuring that we're not wasting our time fighting the not in my backyard fight, and instead we're using our time today to fight dirty energy and to support clean energy. It's going to require us to ensure big regulatory changes that give a leg up to renewables, like feed-in tariff laws like Germany has. It's going to require us to increase research and development budgets. So how do we make our governments do that? You know, Denmark has 20% more wind capacity than Canada. They have a way higher price on carbon. And I once had the opportunity to ask the Danish Prime Minister, how did you do it? How did you do these huge changes 5, 10 years ago? And he looked at me like I was absolutely crazy. And he said, well, I didn't have a choice. Civil society demanded it. Right, they're elected. We are civil society. And not everyone here is going to have the capacity to do this every day, all day long, and make it your career. But we all have the ability to engage. We have the ability to vote. We have the ability to organize in our communities, to take action, to join environmental groups, to use presentations like these and talk to our friends and family about it. And we have to. We have to celebrate progress. We have to engage. Because we are living the tipping point, but we need to be able to grab hold of it and move it forward. In the climate era, we are responsible today not only for what we do, whether we ride to work and change our light bulbs, but we're responsible for what we don't do. I found the energy revolution modeling inspiring. But the fact is, that we can't predict what the future holds. We can try, and we can try to move ourselves in the right direction, but we can't predict it. We don't know what the future holds in the climate era, but we know who holds it. Thank you.